Thank you, Tim. And for all you Torontonians and Canadians, good afternoon. And for the traveling party from Australia, good Sunday morning. It is, I think, sir, about 3:30 your time. And so we were delighted you'd be here anyway, but to know that it's 3:30 in the morning and you're here, we really appreciate it. I want to do a couple of things. First, we'll chat back and forth for a few minutes, and then we're going to open the floor to questions from all the people that are here. There are 2 microphones in the room, and when you have a question, either hold up your hand and the microphone will come to you, or stand up if the microphone doesn't seem to be seeing your hand, and time permitting, we'll have as many questions as we can. Now, Deputy Prime Minister, I want to talk about the G20, but I have to ask you first, because in the reception before the lunch, a number of people asked me, and I didn't know the answer, the events of the past week in Australia, is this a common occurrence in your country, or is this a very rare and unique happening?
Very rare.
Has it ever happened before?
Yes, it has happened before. It's happened once or twice before, but it's certainly rare. This is not a decision that our parliamentary party took lightly. It was one, I think, that was very difficult and very painful for many in the parliamentary Labor Party. But the decision having been taken, the party is moving forward, the government is moving forward, and I took the view that we did need to be united very strongly behind our new leader, our new Prime Minister, Julia Gillard.
And just so we understand, because in Canada, the political parties over the years have evolved so that the general membership of the party, in other words, if you buy a member and sign up, you get some say in the selection of who the party leader is, and it has to be done either through a direct election process or a party convention. But you have the traditional British model where the parliamentary caucus are those who decide the leader?
Yes, it is the traditional model, and it is a model that both the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party in Australia follows. It is the practice that my party has had for over 100 years. That is that the elected members of Parliament decide the leader and the Cabinet.
And the Cabinet?
And the Cabinet until recently.
Oh. Would recently be 2 days ago?
2 years ago.
So let's talk now about the G20, and you were expressing in your remarks great optimism about it, but it was forged out of the crisis of 2008, and I think even in the run-up to the meetings now, particularly I guess from some of the major players, on some of the issues, particularly one, should we be keeping stimulus in, or should we be worrying now about the size of debt and deficit and taking stimulus out, or not putting any more in if we don't take anything out? And it seems to some people anyway that, crises drive decisions and focus the mind, but when you're not in quite the same kind of crisis, it's harder, the bigger the group, to keep some kind of consensus going. What's your thought on that?
I certainly think it's a challenging outlook for the G20 to maintain the type of momentum that was there at the end of 2008 and through 2009. There was a very powerful, motivating force of the collapse in global demand and the consequent impact upon employment around the globe. So to some extent, the G20, enacting as it did in such a concerted fashion through fiscal stimulus and through monetary stimulus, averted a catastrophic situation. But in so doing, you could say that it also impacted upon the desire for further change. But I think there is enough collective memory around the G20, and I believe an acknowledgement of just how devastating the global recession has been for some economies, for people to understand that we can't lose the momentum in terms of international financial regulation, that we do need to find a way through the financial imbalances that underpinned the events that caused the global recession. So I'm an optimist about that, but I acknowledge that we have to continue to focus on those central objectives. You won't have the powerful force there of the immediate collapse of the global economy, but I think leaders around the G20 understand that they owe it to everybody who lost a job, They owe it to every small business that hit the wall as a consequence of the global financial crisis to continue this momentum for reform. What is also a bit different is that the sort of economy and economy-wide reforms, if you like, and country-wide reforms that we put in place early on are not necessarily going to be the ones that will take us forward from here. There will be vastly different circumstances between regions and between countries. So what suits Canada and Australia when it comes to financial regulation is slightly different than what suits the United States or continental Europe. So in putting forward a solution, which the G20 must, it must recognise there are different circumstances in different countries. So it shouldn't be seen as a failure for the G20 if it produces a course of action where actions are different between regions and between countries. It's just that the response needs to be much more nuanced now. The measures we used back at the end of 2008 and early 2009 were blunt as they needed to be, given how dramatic the circumstances were. As we go forward, responses have to be more nuanced and different.
So the idea then of a bank tax, and I think everybody in the room knows what we're talking about when we use that phrase. Obviously, Great Britain now has one. That means France and Germany are going to have one because they don't have to worry about their banks going to London. But Canada doesn't want one. You don't want one. It doesn't matter in terms of financial regulation whether or not there's a common approach at something like that?
Well, there's a whole raft of financial reforms. The critical financial reforms are those that have to do with the quality and quantity of capital. These are the critical reforms that we must get right if we are going to avoid a recurrence of a Lehman Brothers type event. So getting those reforms right is very important, but also it's just not the regulations, it's the supervision. And this is where I think Canada and Australia have been so well served. Our regulators in our two countries are very highly regarded and I think perform very well during this period. The detailed work that has taken place through the Financial Stability Board and the Basel Committee has been progressed a very long way, but it won't be complete until towards the end of the year, and it will be considered its soul. So when people are talking about financial reform, they're not focusing on those fundamental underpinning reforms because they're not effectively going to be dealt with at this meeting. So there's a lot of focus on a so-called levy that the Europeans are very keen on. But a levy of itself doesn't do anything to fix the underlying problems that caused the global financial crisis. What it's all about, its proponents say, is providing the resources to deal with a collapse should it occur. In our country, we've already got a resolution scheme in place and had one in place before the global financial crisis in the event that there were collapses. So we don't need a levy in Australia. We've already got a means to resolve that and to pay for that. The truth may well be that some people who want a levy are looking to a levy because they just want to raise a bit of extra money.
Well, I think you're thinking of the British budget, but you don't want to say that because it doesn't go to a bank fund, it just goes into the general revenues. So capital liquidity capital and liquidity are not the same thing, and the amount of leverage that banks, do we need common international standards on that, or can they vary from country to country too?
I think we need a common framework, but there will be differences between countries. What will suit, well, a liquidity rule that would suit European banks or North American banks certainly wouldn't suit Australian banks in the same way, although Australian banks are in very good nick. And of course, when it comes to capital, Australian banks are very well capitalised. So there are differences, and you simply can't have one size fits all. You do need a common framework, you do need a common set of principles, but you do need some national flexibility to ensure that they work in the way that is appropriate for the different circumstances in different countries.
And countries should be responsible for regulating their home banks, even though banks now are international and some of them make more money, well, for a while anyway. Iceland is the prime example. They do more business outside their country than they do in because it's a very small country, and see the trouble they got into. But so how would you look at some kind of global oversight on these countries if they're going to have not one-size-fits-all regulations, but I guess some commonalities and standards.
Well, that's already happening. We have supervisory colleges which are being established as part of the framework that's being set up. There's been an enormous amount of work that has been done in this area, and if you want to have a look at it, you should simply look through all the work produced by the Financial Stability Board. Supervisory colleges are a reality because everybody acknowledges that many of these institutions which span a number of countries but which are owned by one, which can produce devastating consequences for that country should there be a collapse. You must recognise that you need someone who's looking at their operations in different countries holistically and doing that with the national regulators across those countries. And that's what the supervisory colleges will be doing and are now doing.
But will they have an enforcement function that they don't have now? The supervisory is supervision without punishment is observation rather than supervision.